Welcome, witches, to the last part of Reddit user Nice Guy Phil's disturbing movie Iceberg. And I want to get something out of the way now. This video will be in no way play into my strengths. You are not watching this to see me critically break these movies down. You're watching this to see me more uncomfortable than I've ever been on this channel. You know it, I know it, it's okay. I do really enjoy critiquing horror stories in particular because I think they can be incredibly revealing about our society. You know, horror likes to tackle the subjects that we don't particularly like to contend with. They're ugly and uncomfortable. But the thing about most of the stories that I critique is that they're not actually produced by people who actually do or defend the sort of things that they write on screen or depict on the page. Meanwhile, a lot of the movies that we're talking about today are either adult films or shockumentaries depicting real events. And I know that was sort of true about the last video, but these movies do feel a little bit less staged and a little bit more real. And while previous movies on this iceberg have played with paraphilic themes, it was still depicted in a way where it was supposed to be viewed as disgusting or inhumane or at the very least weird. That isn't necessarily the case with all of these movies, which were clearly made for and by people with paraphilic disorders in some cases. That may also contribute to the reason why I have only watched one of the movies that we're talking about today. I have no regrets. So without further ado, let's get straight into it. We're on the 7th tier now, and most of the movies that we're going to be talking about here are adult films. Again, talking about adult films does make me uncomfortable, but I do want to approach this from a very sex-positive place. No kink shame. As long as everyone involved is a consenting adult, it's all good here. It's just, not everyone here is intended to be read as a consenting adult. Some of them are fish. Not all of these movies are adult films, and I will mention that when that's the case, but without further ado, let's just get into it. Death to Kufar. It's actually really difficult to find any information about this one online, but if I were to judge based off the DVD jacket, which is the only thing that I can find, it appears to be a documentary of sorts that features real executions and real beheadings. Kuso Milk 1-4. So this is a series of adult films that involve scenes of women funneling live eels into each other's backsides, and there's also some scat involved. I hear this one's really appealing if you have a thing for gross stuff. UNKB 002. Another adult film, this one mostly features poop. On every part of a woman's body, especially if it's humiliating. I hate this. Channel 309. So I found some dissenting reports on what this one was really. The one thing that everyone seemed to agree on was that it was definitely a horror-themed adult film. But beyond that, how real everything is seems to be up to debate. I stumbled across this one Reddit thread full of people claiming that this was definitely a real snuff film full of CP. But other people in the same thread claimed that it was just edgelord satanic imagery played out by consenting actresses. But yeah, either way, I feel like this is one that you're just gonna want to avoid. Squirmfest. I want to reiterate that I did not actually watch this movie, but I did find a pretty thorough description of it online. I'll spare you some of the grosser details, just suffice it to say that it was enough to make me nauseous just by reading it. So the movie starts out with a woman eating a dish of noodles and worms. Apparently enjoying it a lot more than Michael did in The Lost Boys.
Why don't you try some noodles? Worms.
She then goes on to drink milk filled with worms and food covered with maggots.
You're eating maggots, how do they taste?
After watching the worst mukbang in the world, you're then forced to watch this woman, go to the bathroom all over the floor. Apparently there are still live bugs in it, and she eats it all again. I think those are enough details. Vomit Enema Ecstasy 1 and 2. This is another adult film all about... do I even need to say it? It's in the title. Kuso Limitless. So I'm going to say this right now, researching for this tier was a little bit all over the place. Some of these movies were impossible to find any information on, unless I wanted to Dorothy my way through this list and follow the yellow brick road that the internet suspiciously set up for me, to apparently end up on the site that would supposedly screen the video itself. But that yellow brick road is made of a lot of broken links and honestly probably a lot of viruses. And the Emerald City is actually made of excrement and humiliation. magician. And the Wizard of Oz was the Marquis de Sade the whole time. I don't really know where I'm going with this metaphor, but yeah. Some of these movies were actually fairly easy to research, but only because of the existence of shock sites where fans of this content would put out thorough reviews. But outside of the personal websites of hardcore fans, there really was no signs that these movies existed at all. No IMDb page, no Wikipedia page. Don't even bother asking if Roger Ebert or Rotten Tomatoes put in their 2 cents. And then there was Kuso, which is not only extensively written about, but it's available on Shudder. I have a Shudder subscription, and I have never regretted that more than now. One thing that I've honestly struggled with doing this Iceberg is that I feel kind of guilty talking about movies that I haven't actually watched, as much as I've tried to do as much research into them as possible. Doing that still feels a little bit like the Tinder dating of movie reviewing. You know, I've seen a couple of pictures, read a bit of text, and formed a complete impression off of that, without ever getting to know the complexities of theme and feeling. In some cases, I think that that's okay though, because I don't particularly care about the thematic complexities of Vomit, Enema, Ecstasy 1 and 2. But reading about this movie and then realizing that it was so readily available, yeah, I've gotta get over that whole guilt thing. It's doing me no favors. This is actually a real movie for once, directed by rapper Flying Lotus. It's a collection of vignettes that all take place in Los Angeles after it's been completely decimated by an earthquake and the survivors have been genetically mutated. And the entire points of these vignettes are just to be as disgusting as possible. The first short follows a couple who enjoy a little bit of consensual choking, which would be great, except they do not at all do it safely. You do not want to push on the front of your partner's throat while choking them. That can crush the esophagus and cause permanent damage. Focus more on the sides of the throat and never push hard enough to limit speech. Remember that they should still be able to deliver a safe word if needed. And always get clear, sober consent before wrapping your hands around someone's throat. Just a little bit of sex advice from your friendly neighborhood pan-romantic demisexual. A bunch of stuff sort of happens. A gassy elf discovers this thing.
Now, you can attempt to resuscitate the child, or alternatively, drink this jug of spit.
They get back to the choking. We then cut to this woman living with extremely obnoxious Sesame Street rejects. She goes to the bathroom and takes a pregnancy test that turns out positive. At which point, a man's head rises out of the toilet and proceeds to graphically describe the time that he her while she was passed out drunk. She uncomfortably plays along until he goes away, at which point she returns to smoking weed with her Sesame Street rejects. I think I'm gonna stop explaining the movie linearly here because that's really doing nobody any favors. Suffice it to say that everything that I've mentioned does have a payoff, albeit a weird and gory one. Like, the pregnant woman ends up seeking out an abortion, but all that she's offered is a coat hanger. She ends up telling her about the pregnancy, at which point he tries to restrict her from getting an abortion. Her Sesame Street reject friends help out by trapping him in a music video world to be sexually humiliated and objectified forever. They then psychically abort the fetus, at which point she suggests smoking it. And I mean, obviously the story is gross and unpleasant, and I don't think that I'd recommend it to anyone ever, but there is a little bit of like gross punk feminist power to this story in a weird way. The emotions behind the are extremely well established. You see both how he disregards her personhood completely and how she just kind of plays along with it to avoid rocking the boat or causing a scene. As a result, she self-medicates with weed, which actually helps her disassociate enough that she can endure the poor treatment. At least until a third person is involved with this pregnancy. She makes the difficult decision to get an abortion, but her personhood is stripped even here, as her choice is taken away and she's backed into a corner that she never wanted to be in to begin with. She can either accept further harm to herself or she can defend herself at the risk of hurting her. And she chooses the latter, but even in doing so, the choice is so difficult that she needs to further self-medicate. Perhaps turn into something harder and more extreme just to cope. It's a bad, almost hopeless situation, sure, but I really do appreciate that the movie takes care to track her emotional progress through it. And I'm not gonna say that it's a perfect feminist movie or anything. Like, when she's sitting in the abortion clinic, she has this conversation with a man who has this intense fear of breasts, who basically tells her that she's a bad person for not telling the father of the baby before she went to seek out the abortion.
It kind of just seems like the courteous thing to do, the nice thing to do. No, I'm not saying that you're a nice person. I'm not saying you're like not a nice person.
And this entirely plays out as the reason why she puts her life and safety in danger by telling her about the pregnancy. Now, to be fair, the guy in the clinic doesn't really know that it's a situation. And I guess that you could argue that this scene is supposed to be him asserting an opinion based off of not enough information, you know, all of that. It just plays out so sincere and as though he's completely in the right here, which comes across as incredibly contradictory when you follow it up almost immediately with a scene that proves why shouldn't really have a choice in what happens to the children they conceive.
How about this? How about I slit your throat and take that child for myself?
Sure, if it's a consensual relationship, then telling the boyfriend might be the nice thing to do. But even then, as a stranger just meeting somebody in a clinic, you have to consider the possibility that her boyfriend might be hostile, controlling, or abusive. And reproductive coercion is a thing. There might be a perfectly legitimate reason why she's not telling her partner, and unless you know that reason for a fact, it's best to stay out of it. But I'm not going to deny that there are plenty of interesting themes touched on in this movie. Many of them around the subject of gender, but I've already wasted more than enough time on this movie. Weirdly enough, the thing that this reminds me of more than anything is Where the Dead Go to Die, a movie that I have historically hated. It has the same abstract animation segments and distorted audio, and just disgusting nonsense. It's all just done about 1,000,000 times better. Flying Lotus is clearly a much better director than Jimmy Screamer Claus, which is kind of interesting to me, because Mr. Screamer Claus actually has a cameo in one scene as a patient, so there's clearly an interesting connection there. Kuso is just a gross, weird little example of a postmodern film, plus there's an almost musical element to some of it that I really do appreciate. But then again, my partner walked in on me watching this and immediately asked me to turn it off, so maybe my brain is just broken from this iceberg. KT trilogy. I'm not gonna lie, I had a hard time narrowing down exactly what this was referring to, but I did find one Reddit thread where someone was asking about it on a subreddit dedicated to Mondo films, so I'm gonna assume that it's probably some sort of true gore shockumentary. But again, that's all guesswork because this one is extremely elusive. The Motel Files and Other Random Cuts. So this is actually one where the concept is slightly more disturbing than the execution from what I hear. This is a mixtape of sorts compiled together using clips from the inside of hotel rooms. So it's supposed to confirm your suspicion that hotel staff are secretly spying on you with cameras and selling your most private moments. But again, from what I hear, they kind of extra sensationalized it a little bit too much for it to actually feel like that. Everyone in the motel is wearing masks, so clearly trying to hide their identity, and they're all engaging in sex acts that are just a little bit too extreme for the average person. In this case, I think subtlety would have paid off a little bit more. You know, if they just interspersed the more extreme stuff with the more tame stuff that you'd expect to see on a motel on any given night. And why am I giving these people advice on how to make these movies worse? Just don't watch or make these movies, okay? Genki Genki 18, 19, and 21. We have another series of adult films here, all of them featuring animals like fish, bugs, eels, octopuses, and more. For instance, in Genki Genki 18, a woman is chained up, stripped naked, and beaten with fish. The fish are then torn apart and their guts are rubbed all over the woman, fed to her, and, used as lubricant.
Fish are friends, not food.
Sadie Scream Volume 1 to 5. We have a pseudo-snuff film mixed with an adult film here, guys. So a journalist is offered the opportunity to interview a garbage collector who disposes of bodies for the Yakuza. And she's somehow convinced to conduct the interview alone in a bikini. And of course, he kidnaps and tortures her. I hate it. The sequels are more or less the same thing, just without the journalist setup. For instance, the fifth one starts out with the torture and then reveals in retrospect that the victim was chosen because she rejected our killer. No Vaseline, the great adult film swindle. Another adult film with scat and vomit and hardcore BDSM. Typical humiliation kink stuff, but with the addition of a disturbing soundtrack. We're on the 8th and final tier now, and this is where things get really bad. As in, there's debate over whether or not some of these movies are illegal to watch. The majority of the movies on this tier are gore mixtapes, which are basically what they sound like. They are compilation movies put together using content that would appeal to fans of extreme content. So there's some gore scenes from movies, and just some clips of people who might be considered outside the mainstream, but all of this is interspersed with scenes of real gore, hardcore adult film scenes, and animal torture. I'm sure you're really excited to hear some examples of that, so let's get into it. Emoções sexuais de cavalo. For those of you who don't speak Portuguese, this title can be translated to the sexual emotions of a donkey, or the sexual emotions of a horse, depending on who you ask, but the distinction doesn't really matter because this adult film has both. It follows an HIV-positive escaped inmate who celebrates his newfound freedom by people and hunting down his father through brothels. Why? Also, casual reminder that most people who are HIV positive are just people trying to lead a normal life, and that with modern medicine and treatment, such a thing is actually possible. If you or someone you love is HIV positive, I see you, you are valid, and you are worthy of love. Fetus Munchers Volume 1 and 2. One thing that does need to be said about this movie is that it's not available through any mainstream means. If you want to view this, you either need access to the dark web or you need to know a guy. And possibly as a result of that, there is a lot of speculation about this online. Some people say that it's illegal to watch this, but considering the amount of people who have been persistent enough to do it and weren't arrested to my knowledge, I think reports of that have been exaggerated a little bit. It's a mixtape consisting of some anime gore, some real gore, some adult film clips, some movie gore, and some animal abuse. The other rumor that you'll also hear about this movie is that it contains real CP, which is apparently untrue, but it still contains clips like 3 Guys, 1 Hammer, if you know what that's referring to. If you don't, it's this video that was leaked onto the internet depicting 2 Ukrainian serial killers torturing 48-year-old Sergei Yatsenko with a hammer and a screwdriver. Yatsenko had been riding his motorbike to visit his grandson when these 2 men selfishly chose to cut his life short. He had recently been left mute by a bout of throat cancer, and he left behind 2 sons, an adoring wife, and a mother who he had been caring for. Registros Fete 3. From what I can tell, this is another gore mixtape, this one by Brazilian filmmaker Lizero Han. I can't find too much information on this one, besides that there is real gore and animal abuse, which I guess is kind of to be expected with these gore mixtapes. FUBAR. For those of you who don't know, FUBAR is an acronym for Fouled Up Beyond Recognition. So naturally it's been used as the title for multiple horror and even comedy movies. Most of which I doubt are the one they're referring to. Yeah, in this case they're referring to a gore mixtape. That being said, I couldn't find any details about what's on the mixtape, and I do refuse to watch it, so sorry. Most Disturbed Person on Planet Earth 1 to 3. This is a sort of shockumentary / Mondo film in the same vein as Faces of Death. And the first one actually contains a couple of clips that you might recognize by reputation. There's 2 Girls, 1 Cup, which is an adult film featuring 2 women eating scat. But then there's also 1 Lunatic, 1 Ice Pick, which is a viral tape showcasing the murder of Jun Lin, a 33-year-old engineering and computer science student from China. He was a closeted gay man who moved to Canada in the hopes of finding acceptance. Just weeks before the murder, Jun Lin and his boyfriend Lin Fen ended their relationship due to the overwhelming pressure from Jun Lin's family for him to date a woman instead. He was lured to Luca Magnotta's apartment with a Craigslist ad looking for people who wanted to help him make a fun movie. Instead, Jun Lin was stabbed to death with a screwdriver that was modified in the video to look like an ice pick. Jun Lin leaves behind his cat, who his best friend Benjamin Zhu describes as being like his baby. Snuff R73. This is another gore mixtape that has garnered a lot of speculation over time. And because of that, it's sort of difficult to tell what's true and what isn't. Some people claim to have viewed it, but that being said, it's rumored that the version that they've seen is not the full version, and that there's a full extended version on the dark web full of illegal content. Another rumor that I've heard raised around this movie is that the director may or may not have been friends or maybe even in a relationship with Luca Magnotta. and may have even been involved in filming his animal torture videos, but again, that's all unconfirmed. There's also this rumor that the mixtape contains CP, which honestly, I would like to stop hearing about mixtapes if they actually don't. I don't know, it just seems to create this environment where someone feels the need to come out and say,
"Don't worry, it's not CP, it's just babies getting shot."
Which, yeah, that's not much better. There's also a lot of war footage and, of course, one lunatic, one ice pick. Hence the Luca Magnotta connection. Ogrish collection. From what I can tell, this is a collection of clips that were uploaded to the shock site Ogrish, which at one point specialized in uncensored videos of war, accidents, and executions. I would not recommend looking these movies up, by the way. The DVD cover for the first one contains a pretty graphic image of someone who's recently received a shotgun injury to the face. Adult Film Gore, Volume 1 and 2. I hate this. Yeah, this is another mixtape. This one a collection of the most gory, graphic adult films on the internet. And just like that, I've sworn off sex forever. Are there any Wiccan nunneries? I'm not looking for a huge lifestyle change here, but I have to admit the celibacy's looking pretty good after this Iceberg. And now that we've covered all the movies on the Iceberg, I do find myself asking if it's at all appropriate to even compare them to the movies that started it out, like Friday the 13th and Annabelle. This movie tends to circulate online as the disturbing movie Iceberg, but when it was first posted, it was given the title of the horror movie Iceberg, implying that this is some sort of natural descent. I will admit that I've been able to find a morbid appreciation for some titles on here that I didn't really expect to. But more than anything, I think the thing that I've learned is that the people who are watching Child's Play are not necessarily the same people who are watching Squirmfest, and vice versa. In general, I tend to think of horror as a very healthy genre. You know, we all deal with negative emotions like fear and anger and hopelessness. And these are the sorts of emotions that horror tends to tap into, which might be part of the reason why horror is such an intense genre for some. But a good horror movie leads the way towards overcoming those negative emotions. For instance, a good final girl can show the audience that it's okay to feel frightened. It's okay to even feel victimized sometimes, but you don't have to stay in that victim role forever. And it is possible to overcome the darkness. And you do not see that in a lot of these movies on this Iceberg. Kuso was easily my favorite movie discussed in this video because at the very least, it addressed the complicated emotions that are often experienced after a such as this. It didn't really give us a way to overcome the darkness. In fact, if anything, it kind of just wallowed in it at the end. But at the very least, it put some thought behind the victim's perspective instead of just, you know, capitalizing on victimhood. And on the one hand, I understand the argument that the horror depicted in these movies is oftentimes more real. And maybe that's sort of the appeal to some people. We're not talking about simple feelings of fear and anger and hopelessness. We're talking about the reality of senseless, bloody death. And for people who do have a higher tolerance for horror, then maybe that reality is precisely what they need. That being said, I think that we can all agree that there is a huge difference between acknowledging that we all have a dark side to contend with and profiting off of real abuse and murder. And as a writer who hopes to continue working in the realms of the dark and the macabre, it honestly does offend me to see these two types of content at all compared. They're not the same. Period. I think I'll leave it at that for now. I might edit together a full version of this Iceberg for you guys at some point, if you wanted to watch it without all my intros and outros, just kind of focusing on the movies themselves. So keep an eye out for that coming soon. Otherwise, I have a lot of exciting ideas coming. I may even have another Iceberg in my sights. So make sure that you subscribe and click that little bell thingy so that you don't miss anything. Thank you so much for watching, my friends, and I will see you next time. If you were to go down to the description box, you would find the Amazon link to my book, Poor Pretty Creature, available wherever you can find ebooks. And well, I'm still here. Although it is completely unnecessary to donate, I do understand that a lot of people are struggling financially right now. I did just want to mention that I have a Patreon, which will be linked below, as well as give thanks to the people who already support me there. Andre K, Scott Falks, Thrill House, and Wilson L. Ricks III. Donations can be as little as $1 a month, but as I said, absolutely no pressure whatsoever. Your support means the world to me, but so does the support of every single person who gives a like or a comment or even just a view. I can't wait to see you all next time.